Big questions for the BBC, and now it seems for The Sun too, over the famous presenter and claims he allegedly paid a young person for sexually explicit pictures. Tonight, lawyers for the individual say the claims in the newspaper are rubbish. The BBC's been on the back foot for days. The Sun is standing by its story. The high-profile star remains unnamed officially, and we don't know how the young person at the heart of this story is. Where does all this leave the corporation and its bosses? A question we have asked before in recent months and years. Surely they have learned from previous scandals. Tonight, we will talk to Alison Hastings, former chair of the BBC's Editorial Standards Committee, who's dealt with a number of BBC scandals, and top agent Jonathan Shalit. Also tonight, as temperature records are broken around the world, we'll ask if climate change means this summer's hot weather is the new normal. And ahead of the NATO summit starting tomorrow, Mark's here with his take.
NATO's been promising Ukraine membership for the past 15 years. But President Biden says the time's still not right. And in West Africa, one of the world's leading anti-slavery organisations is accused of wrongly taking children from their homes as part of a human trafficking crackdown. BBC Africa Eye has the exclusive investigation.
They just came in and grabbed me. One of the men held a gun to my grandma's throat as if to shoot her, so I was terrified and I started crying. I thought they were taking us away to kill us. We didn't know where they were taking us.
Good evening. You don't need me to tell you there is an awful lot going on in the world. So why does the scandal around the famous BBC presenter, still officially unnamed and 24 hours into his suspension, matter? Quite simply, it's about trust. Your trust in the BBC, funded by you through the licence fee. Trust in its high-profile names, some of whom have been forced to deny they are the presenter in question. And it's also about the truth. And I'll be honest with you right now, we don't know if the claims from the mother of the young person who accused the famous name of paying thousands of pounds to her child in exchange for sexual photos are true. Because we, journalists who work at the BBC, haven't seen any of the evidence the Sun says it has. And we don't know if the new claims tonight from lawyers representing the young individual, rubbishing what the mum has said, are true either. BBC News doesn't know the identity of that person and hasn't spoken directly to them. We do know the BBC is in the middle of another crisis and big questions are being asked. Again, about who knew what when and why the corporation is on the back foot. What has it learned from previous crises? Here's Seema.
The BBC is the national broadcaster, funded by the licence fee, and among its public service missions is to tell you what's happening in the world. But in recent months, it's the BBC that's made the headlines. Now it finds itself again in the spotlight. It's been facing allegations that one of its presenters allegedly paid a teenager for sexually explicit photos after a report in the Sun newspaper last week. But now a letter from the lawyers representing the young person was sent to the BBC this afternoon saying nothing inappropriate or unlawful has taken place between them and the presenter, and that the allegations are what they call rubbish. The letter from the legal firm states, "Our client sent a denial to the Sun reporter on Friday evening at approximately 7:20 p.m. by WhatsApp to confirm that the statement their mother had made was totally wrong and there was no truth in it. Nonetheless, the Sun newspaper proceeded to publish their inappropriate article." The Sun told the BBC, "We have reported a story about two very concerned parents who made a complaint to the BBC about the behaviour of a presenter and the welfare of their child. Their complaint was not acted upon by the BBC. We have seen evidence that supports their concerns. It's now for the BBC to properly investigate." The Sun's statement raises questions as to why it didn't report the young person's denial, as stated in the letter. So how did this story come to light? On the 19th of May, the young person's family complained to the BBC. On July 7th, The Sun published a front cover story alleging the presenter paid a teenager for explicit pictures. On July 9th, the BBC suspended the presenter. A day later, the BBC met the police to discuss the matter. This afternoon, the Met Police said they are assessing the information discussed and further inquiries are taking place to establish whether there is evidence of a criminal offence being committed. There is no investigation at this time. The most awkward question for the BBC is what action, if any, was taken following the 19th of May complaint. Newsnight has asked the press office this, but had no response to this specific question. The Director General Tim Davie said new allegations of a different nature were first put to the BBC only on Thursday. One former BBC boss told Newsnight, "The BBC receives many complaints every day, sometimes even hundreds. Most of them are editorial complaints and not of a personal nature. So it's impossible to fast-track these unless they are genuine red light complaints, for example of sexual or financial wrongdoing. Even then, if the original complaint was not flagged as alleged sexual misconduct, it would not have been picked up as rapidly as it would have been had it been so flagged in the first place." Well, the last 72 hours have been incredibly bruising for the BBC, and now it finds itself with a legal letter that says something different to what The Sun has been reporting over the last few days. The letter also says it's concerning that nobody from the BBC has tried to contact our client prior to our writing to you, raising questions about whether attempts had been made to contact the person when the complaint first came in back in May. In a statement, the organisation said it's working as quickly as possible to establish the facts in order to properly inform appropriate next steps. Anger, shock, confusion, just some of the emotions generated by these events that have dominated the news agenda. And even if the allegations were proven to be untrue, some will be asking how hard did the BBC try to contact the young person after the initial contact from their mother? The BBC's sternest critics are likely to see this as further evidence of an organisation with inadequate processes.
Seema, what's The Sun reporting tonight?
Yes, so The Sun's been leading on this story for the last several days, as I just said in that report, and on the front page tomorrow it's leading on the story again. I think we're going to see it just behind me. The headline says, BBC are liars, family of youngster paid by BBC staff for sex pictures. Says corporation ignored bombshell testimony given 7 weeks ago. The stepdad has said in the piece that he told BBC bosses they had screenshots of contact between their child and the star, and I quote, he said, "We put the allegations to them for an hour, but this evening, Victoria, I understand it's not clear whether those screenshots were actually shared with the BBC and whether the two parties actually did speak for that length of time." The article also says, and this is very crucial, it says, "I told the BBC I had gone to the police in desperation, but they couldn't do anything as they said it wasn't illegal." That's from the stepdad. So we've got the police investigating whether anything illegal happened here, although they haven't launched a criminal investigation. We've got the person saying nothing unlawful has happened here, and we've got the stepdad saying that he went to the police and was told there was nothing illegal. So tonight, many of us are trying to figure out still what happened, and we're also trying to figure out whether it warrants the naming of the presenter.
Thank you very much, Seema. Here to talk about all this, we have Alison Hastings, former chair of the BBC Trust's Editorial Standards Committee. She dealt with the Savile inquiry and before that the Jonathan Ross Russell Brand scandal. And we've got Professor Jonathan Shalit, chairman of the founder of the Inter-Talent Rights Group, who represents presenters and journalists such as Susanna Reid and Andrew Neil. Welcome, both of you. Alison Hastings, first of all, should the BBC have acted sooner?
Oh, I'm absolutely sure that the BBC wishes that it had got to the bottom of the allegations before the mother chose to speak to a newspaper, because in those 7 weeks that would have meant that they had an opportunity to understand more about what was going on and potentially then stay in control of the situation. And that, as we can clearly see from the last few days, that ship has sailed and they are now in reactive crisis mode, and that is not a happy place for any organisation to be.
Jonathan, The Sun is reporting, I can't confirm this, we can't confirm this, that according to the stepdad, an hour was spent with the BBC, showing screenshots and so on. I mean, are there any credible reasons why attempts to get in touch with the family don't seem to have been satisfied?
You began this whole programme tonight by talking about the truth. The truth is, we do not know the truth. And that is why I think the BBC are correct not to have made any public statements yet, because until the BBC know the truth, it's wrong of them to say things and preempt what may not be the truth. We have a situation where a mother and stepfather, concerned parents understandably, a 20-year-old, who, albeit a child, is also an adult, and they're saying, back off mum and dad, it's my business, instructing a major law firm, not a minor backstreet law firm, a major law firm, to write in saying that their parents are wrong. The whole thing is a mess, but it's not the BBC created the mess. It is a mess because of bigger circumstances. I guess brilliant journalism by The Sun for having such great stories, for running for 4 or 5 days. It's a media circus many people are enjoying, and it's become much discussion. But the centre of this are a number of people whose lives could be destroyed forever. So I really think there has to be, and there is being, very serious consideration as to how this has progressed and who is named, if they're named, when.
And remember, the young man, via the lawyers, has said what his mother told The Sun is rubbish. Alison Hastings, how serious is this for the organisation and the Director General and other senior bosses?
I think it depends who knew what and when and how they then acted. I understand that the Director General, Tim Davie, is saying that he didn't know anything until Thursday, and that's presumably when The Sun would have gone to the BBC pre-publication for comment. There are lots of complaints made about BBC staff, unfortunately, and very few of them actually come to any kind of fruition. So I personally wouldn't have expected the Director General to be on top of that original complaint. But on the face of it, you would think that there were enough red flags in that information, without knowing exactly what it was, on the 19th of May, to have escalated this up the chain of command, to prevent the situation that we're in now, which is everything having to be done on the hoof with a huge amount of public disquiet about it.
How could it have been handled better? What would you have done?
Again, tricky to know exactly what was in that original complaint, but the fact that the mother, her perception is that it was not being handled, and that led her to go to a national newspaper 6-7 weeks later, I think mean that when the BBC look back and see the lessons are learned, that is going to be the critical timetable as to why they didn't, on the face of it, get a grip of this situation much earlier.
Jonathan Shallett, you represent big names. Was the BBC right to suspend the presenter on Sunday?
Yeah, absolutely correct to suspend the presenter on Sunday, and I think absolutely correct not to name the presenter yet.
OK, that's interesting, because also that led to other big names essentially being forced to deny that they were the presenter.
And that was completely wrong as well, and that is the challenge.
Well, you just said we shouldn't name the presenter, which means...
Well, you can't, because people are being wrongly named, doesn't mean you can turn on the correct person and name them as to defend the wrongly named ones. It's abhorrent the way that people are wrongly named, and that's the terrible thing about social media now. Terrible things can be said on social media, and they are continually, and those 4 people, who are all decent quality people, have had to suffer over the weekend. That's an example of how this whole matter has become very important to the general public. They want to know answers. The BBC are stuck because they can't give answers, they know the answers. And there's so many different stories going around. Alison said about on the face of it, we don't know what the mother said 7 weeks ago. We don't know how she connected with the son. She reached out to the son. Perhaps it wasn't as straightforward as that. And then, of course, we've got the child, now an adult, saying very different things. So therefore, all people can do is wait. And I think they're unrealistic to expect the BBC to play to the gallery and just give answers immediately. I'd say if the BBC give answers before they know the correct truth, they'd be irresponsible.
Alistair Hastings, do you think it was the right decision to suspend the presenter on Sunday?
I think the BBC will have taken legal advice on the situation, that there are issues around duty of care, there are employment law issues, but I think by Sunday they just didn't have any other choice. And that goes back to my point that when you start losing control of the situation like this, then you're maybe making decisions that you might not have done in a colder light of day. But I genuinely don't think that they had any choice. But that does leave a slew of presenters in the ridiculous and remarkable situation of having to publicly clear their own names as the weekend went on. And that's because there is a gap in this story. I mean, there's a lot of gaps, clearly, but one of the gaps is that the presenter has not been named, which I think is right by the BBC. I'm sure they're really hoping that the presenter will come out themselves with their statement and their side of the story. But until that happens, and there's a gap, that gap is filled by wild speculation on social media, which is unedifying, but that is
the way
where we are.
Yeah. How do you think it will play out then?
I think the presenter's name will end up being in the public domain. I think that is a given. How it's done, I think it is yet to be determined. They potentially could try and take some control of this themselves. And when that name comes out, you then just do not know. There could be other allegations to follow. It's not a story that's going to go away. And the one thing that Tim Davie, who I do think has got a grip of it since this weekend, one thing he will have to do is just make sure that this investigation is both quick and thorough, which is not always easy, and then transparent about the findings as much as you can possibly do in a situation like this.
Jonathan Shalit, if you were the agent representing the presenter, what would your advice be?
I'd advise the presenter to come out, name themselves and put context from their perspective. I suspect it's not entirely justifiable what they've done, but I would at least take control. But I would take control of it. I would say you should name yourself, because the speculation going around is helping no one, including you. I have one final thing when it comes to well-known people. The BBC, like all organisations, get hundreds of phone calls from people making false allegations against famous people. And the BBC reacted to every allegation made against an employee of the corporation. It'd be untenable to run it. So I also think when the individual's name comes out and the importance of the individual is understood and known, people will realise how difficult it was to believe what has been alleged was true. And therefore, you can understand some people might not have believed it in the first place, wrongly in hindsight. But that it's about the truth, Victoria, as you open the show.
Alison Hastings, finally and briefly, what does this do to trust in our audience, to people watching us now on Newsnight and other programmes across the BBC?
Well, trust is very hard to build and easy to lose. And unfortunately, this story comes off the back of the Gary Lineker Twitter storm earlier, and then the resignation of the then chairman of the BBC, Richard Sharp. And so this is the third one in quick succession. I think audiences definitely noticed the Gary Lineker story, perhaps not so much interested in the Richard Sharp story from an audience perspective. On this case, I think it depends who the presenter is and what they end up saying and what relationship they have with the audience. There's definitely interest from the public in this story. I think primarily at the moment they just want to know who it is. And that's why the investigation has to be thorough and transparent to help rebuild that trust.
Thank you both very much. Thank you for talking to our audience. Jonathan Shalit and Alison Hastings, many thanks. The records keep coming. June was the hottest on record in the UK. In Canada, this year's wildfire season is expected to be the worst one yet. And climate scientists are warning that 2023 could be the hottest year on record. What does this tell us about long-term global warming? Here's Kate.
Temperature records have been tumbling. Global sea surface temperatures reached a record high in May, June and July. And last week saw the hottest day ever 4 days in a row. Now, these pink lines that should be appearing here are the average daily global temperature across each year between 1979 and 2022. And this is the line for 2023. Last Thursday saw a record average of 17.23 degrees, beating the previous 2016 record by 0.3 degrees. Now, the UK might not have experienced searing heat last week, but almost every continent has been contributing to this record global average. There's been a heat dome across southern US states, prolonged drought conditions across South America, heat waves in North Africa and China, and despite it being the middle of winter in Antarctica, one research base registered a record 8.7 degrees. Now, Antarctic sea ice has actually been at its lowest level since satellite observations began, with 2.6 million fewer square kilometres than average. There are certainly some things contributing which aren't man-made climate change. Take the record sea surface temperatures. They're currently being influenced by a natural climate pattern called El Nino, which comes along every 3 to 7 years. And when that happens, surface ocean winds across the tropical Pacific weaken, reducing the pull for cooler water to come to the surface. And typically, El Ninos are followed by higher temperatures. There are other factors too. Plumes of dust from North African deserts are typically blown across the Atlantic, blocking out sunlight. This year, though, that dust level is significantly lower than usual, which could be letting light in and heating things up. And then there's shipping. New fuel regulations have recently brought down emissions of sulfur dioxide by around 10%. But while that pollutant can impact people's health, in the atmosphere, it also reflects sunlight and helps form clouds. So some researchers suggest the sudden drop could also be playing a role in these record temperatures. But despite all these short-term issues, scientists still think climate change is playing a significant role. Fast analysis by the non-profit Climate Central has found current heat waves in the US and China were made at least 5 times more likely by our warming world. And that weather has consequences. A new paper out today found heat waves across Europe caused more than 61,000 heat-attributable deaths last summer. Almost 3,500 were in the UK. And these latest trends have scientists worried.
We are very much out of the climate that we were used to, and that our societies and our ecosystems have been adapted for centuries. And that now, when we have natural conditions that lead to high temperatures like El Nino events, because we have this very strong underlying warming trend, we get immediately in uncharted territory. But if we don't stop burning fossil fuels, this will not be an extreme event at all. This will be just what summer looks like.
Out though that the temperatures in an El Nino year tend to peak towards the start of August. There is a whole month of our summer to go when further temperature records can fall.
Thank you, Kate. Let's talk to climatologist Michael E. Mann, the author of Our Fragile Moment, How Lessons from the Earth's Past Can Help Us Survive the Climate Crisis. Back in 1999, Professor Mann came up with the famous hockey stick-shaped graph that brought home to many for the first time the impact of carbon emissions on global temperatures. Thank you very much for talking to us, Professor Mann. First of all, Joe Biden and King Charles met today. Is that a big deal?
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be with you. And it is. It's important symbolically. Here we have, two public figures who represent their respective countries, the United States and the UK. Two countries which have a long history of contributing to the climate crisis from the dawn of industrialization to today. And so without the United States and the UK, Europe, the industrial countries of the world sort of taking a lead here and committing to taking the actions necessary to avert catastrophe,
okay,
it sends a message to other countries, hopefully to bring them along as well.
You obviously know this is an El Nino year, as Kate was demonstrating in her piece, so temperatures will be higher. But that's because of natural weather patterns.
So we have, and I thought that the interviewee did a good job in sort of laying out the different factors, as did the presenter, that are sort of conspiring to give us what's playing out right now. But the key underlying factor, undoubtedly, is the steady warming of the planet, which will continue unabated if we continue to produce carbon pollution from fossil fuel burning and other human activities. Sure, there's natural variability on top of that, But think of that as just sort of a wave. And what we've got is a rising tide. And that rising tide of warming is due to us. It's due to carbon pollution. And every time you get a peak in that wave, it'll be higher and higher and higher. And pretty soon we reach thresholds that are truly catastrophic. There isn't a whole lot of time left if we are to reduce carbon emissions in time to avert those catastrophic levels of warming, more than 1.5 Celsius, where we'll see the worst impacts of climate change.
You will have had this conversation with so many people right around the world. And presumably some of those conversations are really difficult because it's going to be disruptive to our lives. It's going to be very, very expensive. And I know you will say, but in the long term, it will be less expensive if we spend this money now. But I wonder if people are listening. Do they want to make those changes to their lives?
Yeah, you know, a lot of the changes that we might make in our everyday lives are things that save us money, and they make us healthier, and they make us feel better about ourselves, and they do reduce our environmental footprint and our carbon emissions. So that low-hanging fruit, we should all do those things, but we can't do it alone. Individual action alone isn't going to accomplish the reductions in carbon emissions that are necessary, so we need policy. We need policy incentives that lead people to make more climate-friendly choices. Here's the thing. We often frame that as a cost, and I think sort of the critics have helped game the discussion in a way where, you know, we often talk about investment when we talk about new fossil fuel infrastructure, and yet when we talk about clean, renewable energy infrastructure, it's suddenly sort of framed as a cost. It's an investment. It's an investment in a clean energy future, and by the way, clean energy, renewable energy offers far more jobs than the heavily automated fossil fuel industry.
Professor Mann, thank you very much for talking to us. Thanks for speaking to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
World leaders are gathering in Lithuania for tomorrow's NATO summit. Top of the agenda, of course, the war in Ukraine, but also on the agenda questions about others joining the bloc. And this evening, the Secretary-General says that Sweden has come a step closer to joining. Here's Mark.
Many in Ukraine had hoped that this summit would be the one where the red carpet of NATO membership would be rolled out to them. But the most powerful member of the alliance does not believe the time is right.
If the war is going on, then we're all in the war. You know, we're at war with Russia, if that were the case. So I think we have to lay out a path, for the rational path, for Ukraine to be able to qualify to get into NATO.
While Britain and some other members favour inviting Ukraine to join NATO, that's not going to happen soon. And indeed, they've already been waiting for 15 years since allies first invited Ukraine to join. And the current fighting makes it impossible.
There's no way NATO can invite into membership a country that is in a full-scale war with an adversary, because that would immediately trigger Article 5, which would bring us all into war with Russia. So I'm sure the summit will come out with some artfully worded language, that's what NATO summits do, to bridge the difference of nuance, frankly. There won't be an automatic invitation to join. Equally, there will be very warm language on Ukraine continuing to move closer to NATO.
And as the case of Sweden shows, even more vanilla countries don't get straight into NATO. Having voted to join earlier this year, the Swedes found objections from Hungary and Turkey frustrated their ambition. Officials had hoped that Vilnius might be the moment that Sweden would be formally welcomed in. But that will take a little longer. Early today, Turkey's president raised a whole new reason to hold that process up.
First, open the way to Turkey's membership of the European Union, and then we will open it for Sweden, just as we had opened it for Finland. In this regard, I said the same things to Mr. Biden last night, and I have to give the same remarks in Vilnius as well.
But once in Vilnius, President Erdogan changed his tune, and after negotiations tonight, an apparent deal in which Turkey would agree to ratify Sweden's membership of NATO.
Turkey and Sweden agreed today to establish a new bilateral security compact. NATO will also significantly step up its work in this area. And I will establish, for the first time at NATO, the post of Special Coordinator for Counterterrorism.
Instead of membership, what NATO will promise Ukraine is security guarantees and weapons like the F-16 to maintain a technical edge over Russia. And the first of these modern jets should arrive in the autumn.
Security guarantees for Ukraine can't mean what we have in NATO, which is a collective defence guarantee. In other words, an attack on one is an attack on all. I think they really mean cast iron assurances we will go on supporting Ukraine with arms, the latest equipment, with finance, with economic reconstruction aid, to ensure that they are strong and spiky enough as a country that no future Russian leader will want to give this another go. I think that's what it really means.
As Ukrainian troops fight on, struggling to turn the tables on the battlefield, the diplomats will be attempting to find the right language, trying to square the circle of why a country that does so much for Western security cannot, for now, join the NATO alliance.
Mark Urban. Let's talk now to former US Ambassador to NATO under the Trump administration, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, who is in Dallas, Texas. Thank you very much for talking to our British audience. I wonder if I could ask you first of all, why is the US more reluctant than other NATO allies to offer a clear pathway for Ukraine's membership of the bloc?
I think it's very important that we give all of the assurances to Ukraine that they deserve. And I think NATO has done that. Certainly the United States has as well. UK has as well. But to talk about membership right now is premature. And of course, we would not want to be putting our own troops' lives on the line in this conflict that has been ongoing now for 500 days. So I think that we will have Ukraine at some point in NATO, and it will be the most rapid succession that we can make it.
OK, but sorry to interrupt, but does that mean, I mean, presumably that means at some point when the war is over. But doesn't that then give an incentive, even more of an incentive to Vladimir Putin to continue low-level attacks in 12 months, 24 months, 3 years?
Well, I don't think so, because I think that the actual munitions that we are going to give them are going to escalate. We know that now F-16s are on the mark. Longer range missiles are on the mark. The cluster bombs, which are controversial, but nevertheless will give Ukraine a much bigger capability to push back the Russians that are on their sovereign territory. And I think that they will get all of those assurances, and we will be there for them. But I think the alliance has to be unanimous in bringing in all of the other factors of rebuilding Ukraine and making sure that it has what it needs to have that resilient democracy, which I know that they will. It's just a timing issue. It's not an issue of if, it is more when.
OK. If Donald Trump, you worked under his administration, or any other Republican becomes the next US president, tell us honestly what you think that will mean for the US's support for Ukraine.
Well, I think that Congress is, in a bipartisan way, totally supportive of helping Ukraine, making sure that Ukraine wins this war. I think the only controversy in Congress is how much we do quicker. And I think that Congress is there. That means that...
And what about if it's President Trump or President DeSantis?
I think they will be absolutely for helping Ukraine. I think that both of them have made a mistake in not being more forthright about it, but I think that I think the bipartisan consensus in Congress is going to remain, and that's going to be essential.
Sure, and that's Congress. I mean, you say they haven't been more forthright. I mean, that's the understatement of the year. I mean, you know, they've been, one said essentially it was a small territorial dispute that had no concern to the US.
That was very early, before he really had all of the facts and the input. I believe that he would be there. I think that the fact that Congress is so bipartisan in its support of Ukraine and seeing the importance of this to U.S. security, to the security of our country, as well as all of our NATO allies, I think will prevail in the election and also in the future for NATO and for the Ukraine support from the U.S.
We'll see. Thank you so much for talking to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, a BBC Africa Eye investigation has raised serious concerns about one of the world's leading anti-slavery organisations and their West African operations. International Justice Mission raised more than £3 million in the UK last year, with the support of nearly 300 churches across the country. Some of the money funded operations in Ghana, where IJM aims to rescue trafficked children and reunite them with their families. But a BBC undercover investigation has found evidence that the charity's activities have caused some children to be taken away from their homes in traumatic night raids. Chen Hene Boaten reports.
This is Moina, a village in northern Ghana. Back in September 2022, IJM and the local armed police conducted a night raid here.
I decided to crawl to see what was happening. Then a gun was held to my throat. I stood up and leaned against the wall. What have I done? What have I done? Tell us. Are you going to kill us? They said no.
IJM's mission that night was to free 4 children identified as victims of trafficking. But these women insist they were looking after their own grandchildren when they were taken away by force.
I was worried. Were they going to kill the kids? What were they going to do with them?
After the raid, the children were taken from their village to a hotel where they were photographed, washed and fed, and then moved to a shelter. Their families had no information about their whereabouts. 11-year-old Fatima is the eldest.
Can you tell me how you felt when you were taken away from your grandparents?
They just came in and grabbed me. One of the men held a gun to my grandma's throat as if to shoot her, so I was terrified and I started crying. I thought they were taking us away to kill us. We didn't know where they were taking us.
This raid was part of IJM's efforts to combat child trafficking into the local fishing industry, a known issue in the area. But some of the rescue missions have been accused of doing more harm than good to the local communities. The concerns are shared by this local MP, who believes many of the children targeted by IJM are also simply living with extended family.
These children have not been sold, transferred, they are not under any question. The family feel that their only means of survival is by going fishing, teaching the children their trade. I've met these children, I've met with their families. What they need is to be with their families and not taken away and kept at places that we don't know.
BBC Africa Eye went undercover to investigate the allegations. Posing as an intern for IJM in Ghana, our undercover journalist was given access to one of the charity's work phones. In there, we found hundreds of WhatsApp messages from dozens of rescue missions, including the raid during which Fatima was taken. In these texts, a legal officer from IJM clarifies their understanding prior to this operation.
Mohammed's case was assessed to be a trafficking case. For the other 3 girls, it came up there were no elements of trafficking.
The messages show that, despite the lack of trafficking evidence, IJM continued to support the village rescue and all 4 children were taken. But why?
Every time you have to push yourself and set a higher target.
According to this staff member, IJM is target-driven, with teams expected to support set numbers of rescues and arrests by the authorities.
We are committing resources, so we can't commit a lot of resources for you to rescue just 10 children in a year. So the targets will be set, you just have to push yourself and achieve them.
Here, our undercover journalist speaks to one of the investigators working in the field.
So what would happen, like, if you get there
Like on the day that you've decided that this is the day you're coming to do the rescue, and then you don't get the children.
Hey, you have to get some.
Ah.
You have to get some.
Good grief. This is frankly unacceptable. It seems to me that entire community is stigmatized because people have to make up the numbers.
Dr. Sam Ochre from the University of Bristol has conducted field research into rescue operations by IJM in Ghana. I wanted to know his thoughts about the recordings concerning a target-driven culture.
These are very well-paid jobs, okay? And the fear of losing a coveted position of that nature would mean that people would go the extra mile to meet the quotas and the targets.
IJM told us that its targets aim to evaluate impact so its work can be most effective. But it denies staff are penalized if they don't meet them. Fatima and the other children were able to return home after social services concluded they had not been trafficked, and criminal charges against 2 of their relatives were also dropped, not without consequences.
Whatever we got from our fishing business to feed ourselves, we spent everything on the case.
IJM Ghana told us that it does not decide whether any individual is arrested or prosecuted with offences, and said that it is social workers who independently decide when a child might be put into care, even if they are not victims of trafficking. After the raid, Fatima stayed in a shelter for about 4 months.
While you were away, what were you thinking?
I was thinking about whether my grandma, grandpa, uncles and mother were still alive. I was wondering if they were dead or alive.
When Fatima returned home, she discovered her grandfather had died.
I was crying and wondering, since my grandfather has left us, where would we see him again?
IJM has told us that their approach always has the welfare of children at its core, and their work has helped bring hundreds of victims to safety. Ghana's social services told us they acted upon information they received from IJM, and in the future, IJM may need to get additional permissions ahead of any rescue operations.
And you can watch the full film, The Night They Came for Our Children, on the BBC Africa YouTube channel. Right, quick look at tomorrow's front pages. The Guardian. Young person at the centre of BBC scandal says claims are rubbish. And there's anger as tour tickets for Taylor Swift are resold at a huge profit. Front page of The Mail. 1 in 6 people know who the scandal hit BBC star is, according to The Mail. And The Telegraph. Ukraine to be offered NATO-like protection. And Geoffrey Boycott says take Bairstow out of the Ashes cauldron. That's it from us tonight. Goodbye.